In this week's episode, we will use modern oil colors and techniques to create an old master inspired portrait in order to sharpen our own visual perception. Welcome to Old Master Style Approach. And remember, if at any point in this video you become curious as to what materials I'm using, please see the description box down below for a list of the oil paints, the brushes, the linen, and all of that information typed up for you. And here's the original image from Google Arts and Culture of a portrait of Rembrandt, which was once attributed to Rembrandt, but is now thought to be a study of a Rembrandt from one of his students. And if you would like access to this photo reference in very excellent detail, please see Google Arts and Culture, where you can find this image. Now please pay very close attention to the wording of the title of this video. This is not thought to be how the old masters painted, nor is it using strictly modern materials. However, we have a mix of classical and modern materials in order to create an old master style painting. It is styled as if it was old master style. Do not think that I'm trying to tell you exactly how to paint like the old masters, because that is not really well known to us today. All we can do is gather information from what art conservationists can find out using scientific data. And so what we're working on today is an 11 by 14 inch quadruple oil primed, very fine textured linen that I have toned several weeks ago using a neutral gray mix of alkyd oil paint. We are drawing with raw umber, which again is it is an old color, raw umber, but it's a perfect color to use for drawing because it's very transparent. It's a kind of neutral brown, which is excellent to layer skin tones over, and in general is a very good color to use for drawing. Diluted with a tiny bit of odorless mineral spirits, which is also a modern tool. Classically, you would use spike lavender oil or turpentine. And the idea here is to use simple straight lines and angles in a very blocky fashion to get an idea of the placement of the head in space. And that brush that you're seeing right there is an eraser brush, which is just a fairly used up, beat up bristle brush that I use just to push the paint around. And the reason we're working on a neutral gray tone is so that once we get into the values, the lights will look like lights and the darks will look like darks. Now in this stage of the painting, there is no measuring. There will not be any measuring at all. Though you could measure, you could use something like a sight size, or you can use a gridding technique, completely up to you. However you want to start out the composition is completely up to you. I just prefer to work with simple straight lines and angles with big blocky shapes and pretend as if I was working from a live model. So the photo reference for me is actually on my tablet screen just off camera, so you're seeing there is no photo reference in the immediate vicinity of the painting as to emulate what it's like to paint from a live model. And the big idea is just to work with simple straight lines and angles. The placement of the head is quite important. I don't want it to be perfectly centered on a vertical. However, centered on a horizontal is not really too big of an issue, so I go for that. I have the head higher up on a vertical, but almost centered on a horizontal, so that it will read a little bit better from a distance, although you can experiment with placing a head lower in the composition or higher if you like. Sometimes perfectly centered works as well, but typically if you place it perfectly centered, it's a little boring to see a picture where the head is smack in the center. However, I do encourage you to experiment with your compositions and see what you like the best. Now I'm using a Viva paper towel cloth to erase once in a while, as I'm working on a very fine textured linen, which I did stretch myself. If you haven't stretched a canvas on your own, I would definitely suggest it. It's a very fun thing to do. Linens are a little tougher to stretch than cotton, but overall linen is my absolute favorite material to work on, and especially a very fine textured linen that is quadruple primed. Again, information will be in the description box down below. But sometimes the linen is so fine that the eraser brush will tend to take too much out and leave too much of a sharp line. So that's why sometimes I opt for the paper towel. And again, I like to use the Viva brand like cloth paper towel. Now with the simple straight lines and angles, the only thing I'm looking for at this moment is light and shadow shapes. And the importance of light and shadow cannot be overstated when it comes to creating an old master style painting. It's been often said that photographers seek to eliminate shadows and painters seem to want to create shadows. And this can definitely be seen in this Rembrandt inspired study, because most of the face on the right side relative to us or left side relative to the model is in shadow with just a little bit of a triangle light on the cheek, also known as Rembrandt lighting. Now this is attributed to be a study, once again, of a Rembrandt. And in fact, if you look it up, it's quite interesting because this was once thought to be an original Rembrandt, and the other painting was thought to be a study of it. And then the roles were reversed when they found out that there was a transfer drawing, I believe. Please don't quote me, I could possibly get that wrong, but it is thought that once they x-rayed the original image that there were transfer lines. And we know that Rembrandt worked with direct painting as much as we can tell using our scientific means of understanding the layers of the old master paintings. Nonetheless, this is a fairly modern approach, working with simple blocky shapes. In the 17th century, they probably would have worked with a much more careful underdrawing, even though they would have been working almost the same with direct painting. I can almost guarantee you that my start is probably more sloppy than what someone would have done in the 17th century. So now we're going to work onto that very loose sketch, a very sloppy but loose and useful sketch. We're going to be using a combination of, that is, burnt sienna, a little bit of transparent mummy, which is iron oxide red, PR 102, pigment red 102, a little bit of the lead tin yellow, and our flake white, mixing it all together without any medium. In the first layer, you don't want to have any medium at all. You want to follow fat over lean if you're going to be layering your painting. And in general, painting very lean in the beginning is just a good idea. It's not a good idea to cover your canvas with an excess of oil and paint into it. That would be quite disruptive to the paint film. And with this basic skin tone, we're going to go around the perimeter of the face. Going around the outside shape of the face, we're using this skin tone to help draw the darkest halftones. Now, the way that I work is very intuitive to me. However, for me to explain this to you, the best way to explain it is I'm using color to draw. So I'm using color to draw and to add more specificity into the light and shadow shapes. Though sometimes I just go right into the midtones and start to define planes and build that way. It's just this time I did it a little differently by going around the perimeter of the outside of the face. And now we're going to go with the mixture of lead tin yellow and a modern color, which was Cadmium Green Pale, Winsor Newton brand, back to the transparent mummy. And you see a lot of lead tin yellow and transparent mummy, but a modern color, which is Cadmium Green Pale, goes into the mix. Now, I need to reiterate this because I know someone's going to point it out. You absolutely do not have to use a plethora of colors like I do. You don't have to. You really don't. You can get away with just using 4 colors, the Zorn palette, so to speak. As I start my students off, I actually begin them with a limited palette and build them up into an extended palette. The benefits of the extended palette outweigh the cons of having an extended palette. Think about it as a piano. You want to have an extended number of keys, as many keys as you possibly can use. Not that I'm a musician, however, this analogy has been made before. It is not attributed to me. This analogy is used by many artists today. They liken a palette to keys to a piano. You want to have just the right number of keys to the piano to be able to create the symphonies or the music that you want to create. Don't consider me an expert on music, because I'm not. It's just an analogy that I heard before. Now you can see the influence of the green and red. So an important thing to note is that I go cross complementary between different hues. So I will go from green to red, neutralize it, and create a skin tone. And in fact, I don't really think too much about the mixtures as I create them. I work more intuitively. I try to keep an intuitive sense to how I mix color. However, in the later stages, I do slow down and start to retrace my steps and try to figure out exactly what colors I used. Now, obviously, the goal is to create a naturalistic representation of the Rembrandt. And the way I'm approaching this is quite modern. I'm going in with color right away. I'm not building an underpainting as per the classical approach. Creating a underpainting with having a very careful drawing would be the more classical way to do it. I like to work with middle values and build my way from there. Take note that the palette will also change, not the colors, but the physical palette itself later on in this video, and I'll explain that later on. There's a specific reason why I change the way the palette looks. Now, let me talk about the brushes, as they're very important in the process. So the brushes are fairly modern, back in the 17th century. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but back in the 17th century, they didn't have silver brush brand filberts. Now, of course, they didn't have silver brush brand because it wasn't invented yet, but I'm talking about filberts. They didn't have filberts back then, and if they did, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments of this video, but I choose to work with filberts because they are pretty much the workhorse, as they've been called, the workhorse brushes, meaning they have the benefits of a round point, but at the same time they have the planar abilities of a flat. So it's a really nice mix between a flat and a round that gives you kind of a shoveled shape that allows you to manipulate the direction of the application of paint. Now, working with the middle tones, I want to establish the lightest light, but not the darkest dark just yet. In fact, I'm using the umber itself, the raw umber drawing itself, as the darkest dark. And in fact, I keep it in this range of values for quite a long time. Some will call this a duotone. At Studio Incominati, the school that I studied in for about a year back in 2011. They called these duotones, not to be confused with two tones, but more or less a very simple color beginning, a simple color statement with an umber drawing as the darker darks. And that is built onto, which is what we're going to be doing here. As you're seeing, I'm mixing up a darker value now. And so we're going to start to put in some of the midtones. The idea behind this is that when you add values, two things are going to happen. One, you're going to be able to see drawing mistakes much more clearly when you have values in the mix. Two, it's going to complicate the drawing. That's just the way it is. It's going to complicate the drawing because you're now mixing plenty of colors. And if you don't have an intuitive sense of color mixing, this can be much harder than using an underpainting. So if you find yourself struggling mixing skin tones, then it might be a good idea to go back to an underpainting and monochrome and build onto it that way. So you're seeing now that we're working with very, very broad mixtures of color. It's important to have a large palette in order to really express the colors and not restrict yourself. Now we're mixing black and white with a little bit of skin tone, which is what I usually use for the sclera. And the sclera is the white of the eye. But remember that the white of the eye is not white. It is usually some type of halftone, and with this Rembrandt, it's definitely a halftone. So it's important to state it in such a way that it doesn't glow. If you make it too light, the sclera will tend to glow and give a sort of supernatural appearance to the eyes. So that's something you want to watch out for. Now, as this is a fairly long video compared to most YouTube videos, there will be times when I slow down the narration. So at this point, I will slow down the rate of narration. And one of the most important details that I didn't explain just yet in the narration is that you want to work past the awkward stages. The most difficult thing in portrait painting, especially if you're trying to do a study of, say, a Rembrandt, is the awkward stages. And the awkward stage, remember, it's natural. It's natural for the painting to appear quite awkward because, number one, you're creating an image of a human being, and number two, we're just not used to seeing unfinished faces. We see completed faces in the form of photographs all the time, in ads, in movies, in Netflix shows. We see fully completed faces all the time, and think about it. The only times we really see incomplete faces is in scary movies, when an apparition shows up missing some of the features or the completion of some of the features, which is why it can be difficult to look at our own paintings of portrait paintings, that is, unfinished. The more time you spend painting portraits, the less time you spend actually worrying about the awkward stage. And in fact, when I was live streaming on YouTube, the awkward stage was frightening the daylights out of me. It is quite terrifying to live stream or to paint publicly and have viewers look at your incompleted artwork and criticize it. That is why anyone that does live streaming on YouTube are definitely superheroes. Those that can do that and maintain their peace of mind are definitely heroes, in my opinion. I simply do not have the tenacity to be able to paint live for extended periods of time to hundreds of people. Therefore, for me, painting while watching a Netflix show or something is ideal because I can have something in the background but also focus on the act of painting and have a camera rolling but not necessarily worry about the audio. What is the significance of this? What does this mean to anyone? It means a lot because when you're painting, you want to get in a certain rhythm. Now, the old masters had their way of doing things, and as Nelson Shanks says, it'd be kind of egotistic or unrealistic to come along and all of a sudden with very little knowledge think that we can do better. Of course, I'm paraphrasing Nelson Shanks, but the old masters spent a lot of time creating their artworks, and in fact, in today's fast-paced, styled, everyone's lifestyles is fast-paced. It's very important to be able to take time and really observe. Do what you need to do. Play music. For me, it's Netflix. I always have Netflix playing in the background. It helps me focus. It helps me relax. It helps me get into a zone and be able to work for hours at a time, for days, at a time. It is very important to be able to get into that type of rhythm with your artwork, because that can also help you expand on your concentration and your focus. When it comes to painting, concentration and focus are something that I, in the past, spoke very little about. But in this painting in particular, it needs to be mentioned, because this painting will be taken to a level further than my previous master studies, having a total of perhaps 10 or more hours in the painting process to get the final result that you saw in the beginning of the video. Now, going back to the actual act of painting, what we're doing is we're working with the darker midtones now. In the beginning, we worked with just the raw umber as the darkest value and working with the lighter lights. Now we're working with darker midtones, and we put in some of the darker accents for the eyes and for the eyebrows and the nostrils. So darker accents will now expand the value range. And in expanding the value range, we now have another set of values that we can continue to draw with. And the idea again is to use the midtones in order to guide the light and shadow shapes. If you work with a fully completed light and shadow start, then all you really have to do is fill in the lights and then work up the midtones. That is a more classical way of working. This is a more modern approach where you go in and you figure things out all at once, a la prima style. And you're seeing the values and the colors build up little by little, one small step at a time. The beginning is the most fast-paced. The Umber sketch, and even at this point, it's fairly fast-paced compared to what you'll see later on, where you make big changes and things are as movable as possible. We will be building up to the smaller shapes, and in fact, we're doing that as I speak here. A small shape for the eyes using a size 2 filbert bristle brush, silver brand. Again, a mix between black and white and a little bit of skin tone. We now begin to subdivide the smaller shapes and begin to push the edges into more specificity. And the quadruple primed, very fine textured linen, again, is a superb surface to work on. I bought mine from Jerry's Artorama here in the US. I try to look for the best sales that I possibly can, and Jerry seems to have some of the best sales. Now, I'm not sponsored by anyone, so I'm just telling you what materials I like to use and why. So as we're beginning to build smaller shapes, it's really nice to have a fine textured linen. Number one, linen is more firm than cotton, so when you paint on linen, it has a different feel. Number two, linen is what the old masters painted on, though they used different materials to prepare it, such as rabbit skin glue and lead primers, whereas today we use PVA glue and titanium white, mainly alkyd based, for our oil primers today. It's still a very nice experience to build on a very classical material, such as oil primed linen. The way the paint flows onto the materials is something worth noting. Now that we're mixing in a combination of alizarin crimson and Viridian, we're mixing up a very nice and earthy dark brown, adding in a little bit more warmth with transparent mummy and cooling it down a bit with cadmium green pale. Now we're going to start to hypothesize the shadow shape and the shadow color. Again, this is modern in the sense that we're doing many things at once, alla prima style. Alla prima means wet on wet. So not only are we figuring out the drawing, but we're also figuring out the color. So we're working with color to figure out the drawing. In essence, multitasking. Yes, it makes drawing difficult, but once you spend more time practicing your color mixtures in the sense of color studies and specific projects when it comes to painting, this is actually a much faster and much, in my opinion, more fun way to develop a picture. Again, we're working with the outside edge of the nose, and with color, we're determining the shadow shape and the dark light shape of the side of the nose, just as the values of the nose transition into the shadow plane. And now let's talk about edges. So the distinction between light and shadow is very important, but also the distinction between interior edges and exterior edges between a given shape. So take the nose for instance. The nose has all of the interior shapes and planes beginning to develop, and the exterior shapes around the light of the nose, meaning the border between light and shadow on the side of the nose and all of the planes surrounding the nose. You want to control the variation between your edges between the interior shapes and the exterior shapes. Sharpening edges all throughout will flatten out a picture and make it look two-dimensional. Blurring the images or blurring the edges all throughout the picture will also flatten it out and make it look very two-dimensional. So what does that mean? You need to vary your edge quality all throughout in order to really describe form. So you use edge to describe form, and you use edge to create specific points of interest to the viewer's eyes. Now we are blurring the edges as light transitions into shadow, and we're actually sharpening edges around the nose, in particular around the bulb of the nose and the wing of the nose. These are features of the skin tone that actually protrude and pull forward. So areas that pull forward are actually going to be a little sharper. The edges will be sharper because they pull forward. Most of the skin tone actually is flat, semi-flat, with certain curvatures, of course, around the side of the face. But the nose is one of the areas with the most contrast between sharp edges and soft edges, simply because of the fact that it does protrude in front and creates a cast shadow and a form shadow. Remember that a cast shadow is a shadow that is just projected from something, and a form shadow is just a shadow resting on the form itself. So now, as you see, some of the camera edits show you in a more accelerated version. However, this is obviously still real time, but you see the jumps between specific parts of the painting where things are described in more detail. And now, as things are being described in more detail, it's important to mention again that the camera is at an angle with respect to the painting. After the first day is over of painting, you will see the image with the camera front and center. But bear in mind that there will be a little bit of distortion from the camera angle now that you're starting to see more of the shapes come into place. And now, as we're subdividing the shapes, it's important to break it down one step at a time, one plane at a time. So we moved from the shapes of the eyes to the nose, and now from the nose down to the philtrum and to the lips. So the lips are going to start to be developed only after the planes around the mouth have been developed. Now for my students, I created projects recently featuring the features of the face in which we constructed the structure of the mouth before putting in the lips. Very much in the same style that you're seeing here. And now we've switched into smaller brushes. Those are size 5 pure red Sable brushes. Again, Silver brand. And no, I'm not sponsored by them. And yes, I wish I was sponsored by them. Silver brush brand they're just the best brushes that I've ever used in my opinion. And for fine detail work, using Sable brushes over synthetics, meaning I stopped using synthetics for details and switched to Sables. The Sable brushes have this ability of which they're very soft. They can create really, really soft edges, but they also carry a lot of paint, almost like a bristle brush. When I use a synthetic brush, it feels like the brush itself doesn't quite grab enough paint, and so I use synthetics actually not to apply paint, but actually to blend paint. But I use Sable brushes for more fine detail work, such as what you're seeing now. Now the mouth itself is very refined in this painting, which again sticks out to me because I don't think Rembrandt, even in his earlier years, put as much time into lips, into detail of the mouth. And if you actually study plenty of Rembrandt paintings, like the one that we did in the previous YouTube video, you'll actually see a lot of characteristics in this painting itself that don't quite add up to an original Rembrandt. However, to stay true to the original painting that we are creating the study of, I do put a lot of emphasis into fine details, such as the curvature and all of the form turning of the lips themselves. And for the highlights, I tend to use lead tin yellow over my flake white. Lead tin yellow is a historical color, and I like to use it because it is a very light, yellowish, cool color that when I mix with other colors such as cobalt blue or something like that, it's a very nice off-colored highlight that has a little bit more character to it than if I were to use just flake white. And as you see, we're starting to build up some of the highlights on the forehead. Switching back to, that is a size 4 filbert extra long Silver Brush Grand Prix brush. And we're starting to add a little more impasto to the paint. Now we're building up some of the light right on the side of the nose, underneath of the eye socket, around the maxilla region of the face. That little pocket of value is picking up quite a lot of light. But the edge quality is in the middle in terms of softness and sharpness. Now I tend to soften edges and sharpen them as I go when I add in the planes. However, from time to time I will go in with a soft blending brush just to manipulate some of the edges and make them softer when need be. Now as we build up these light planes, we're pretty much added in the entire value range on the face. So the value range has reached its lightest light and its darkest dark. Now sometimes I'll place them down right away. Sometimes I'll place down the lightest light and darkest dark right away. But other times, like with this painting, as you've seen here, I tend to work from the lighter middle tones, building onto the gray tone of the canvas. This is why it's very important to have a tone on your canvas so that you have something to build your values up from. Now remember that flake white has this property of which it allows you to use more paint without raising the value too quickly, which enables you to have a thicker consistency of paint. The flake white that I'm using in this painting is actually a modern Flake White. It is not the traditional Dutch process used for Flake White. And as I mentioned this, you're seeing how I'm moving the mouth up. This is why I tell you, keep your shapes simple and easy, so that when the time comes to make changes, those changes are simple and easy to manage. And moving something like the lips is not a big deal because we already established the superstructure of the mouth containing the lips. The mouth is almost everything but the lips. Think of the lips as just a detail. Now going back to the comparison between the Flake White and the more historical lead white, which is stack lead white, a very difficult color, a very difficult pigment to find these days. Stack lead white is the traditional Dutch process of creating lead white, and from what I've read online, it has variable particle sizes to it, so in theory it should allow you to actually have a thicker consistency of paint, even more so than the Williamsburg Flake White that I'm using in this painting. Now we're going to use alkyd oil paint. Alkyd oil paint, we're going to be using titanium white, yellow ochre, raw umber, and ivory black alkyd oil paint. And I'm going to use alkyd oil paint for the background. Please note that alkyd oil paint is a very fast drying oil paint. And I'm using a fast dryer in the hair and pretty much all of the background so that it dries to the touch for the next day. Now, Flake White, the Flake White that I'm using for the face, will actually be touch dry in 24 hours too. I'm using the alkyd colors because I want the background to be extra dry when I continue to build the skin tones, because it will sink in and allow me to build with much more specificity the next day. So there it is. Very quickly, we used, again, ivory black, yellow ochre, titanium white, and raw umber for the background tones. And for the collar, titanium white alkyd. We will go over it with Flake White the next day. So this is what the painting looks like after day 1. So we're going to let this painting set aside for a little while. And the next day, we return to a dry painting. We're going to check the background first, and that's pretty dry. And we're going to check the skin tones with a palette knife. Do not run your hands on top of the Flake White. Use a palette knife first, just in case any of the Flake White is not dry. Remember that Flake White is a lead-based white, so you have to be a little cautious when you use it. Now then, we've switched the palette, not the colors, but the physical palette, and now let me explain why as I remix the skin tone. I've changed it because I actually painted my original palette gray, similar to this color, so that on camera the colors would appear more clear. As I do teach my online students by uploading new lessons twice a week, it's very important for me that my students can see the skin tones and the colors as clear as possible. And for me, it helps me a lot because my skin colors sometimes tend to look like the wood grain color of my palette, which is why I switched to a gray palette. This is a wooden palette that I'm using. It is actually made by the New Wave brand. It is called New Wave Tabletop Palette. It is a 16 by 20 inch neutral gray, furniture grade as they call it, furniture grade wooden palette that they colored themselves, and it's pretty much perfect for my purposes when it comes to mixing paints and to see my colors show. Again, I'm not sponsored by any of these brands. I'm just telling you what I like to use and why. And you can really see it show through as I'm switching from different colors. That was Viridian mixed with the red colors, so Cadmium Red Deep, Old Holland, and Viridian mixed together. And for the next application of paint on this painting, it's all going to be down to the subtlety. So not a lot of stuff is going to happen in a very long period of time, which is why this YouTube video is edited so you can see it at a much more reasonable pace. Now we're working with Cadmium Red Deep. My favorite Cadmium Red is from Old Holland. I like to use Cadmium Red Deep from Old Holland. And we're using a very transparent green, which is Terre Verte. Terre Verte green from Michael Harding. Though with Terre Verte, you can use any brand. To me, they kind of work the same. And we're adjusting all of these edges very carefully. Now, a lot of this is going to be down to edges and color. So most of the face is actually quite flat when it comes to the value transition. So a lot of the work now is going to come down to color variation and edge work. So we're using lead tin yellow, raw umber, again with the Terre Verte and to the Viridian. Here's how I use modern colors to create quote-unquote classical looking skin tones, classical looking old master skin tones, because I'm sure you're wondering how I'm using all these colors to create a painting that looks like it was done with a limited palette. So what I do is I go across the color wheel, I go across the color spectrum. As you're seeing, I'm going across from the reds to the greens, the blues across the other side of the palette, and of course I'm using a lot of the lead tin yellow and transparent mummy. So essentially I go across between my reds and my greens. Neutralizing them diminishes the intensity of my modern colors, and diminishing the intensity of modern colors is very important if you want to emulate the look of old master paintings, because old master paintings are not that saturated, not that bright, not that intense. So that is how I get these effects, by going from complementary colors to create a limited palette look. And now, as you see, a lot of time has gone by, a lot of mixtures have happened on the palette. Again, you see how useful it is to have this neutral gray tone on the wooden palette, which is why I'm using it. And now I'm using a very warm, slightly yellowish mixture, which is primarily yellow ochre and some of the Viridian and transparent mummy. And we're going to start to paint in some of the details for the hair. The hair is going to have light and shadow, as you already see it. It has light and shadow. And now, on top of the light and shadow, we're going to be building the planes in very specific details. So now you're seeing it transition from very simple light and dark shapes. The face now has more detail added to it. And using a mix between Indian yellow, which is a bright, very transparent yellow, yellow ochre, raw sienna, and raw umber, enables me to get this color. And there you have it. The background has been darkened a little bit, and we have much more detail added to the hair. And that's all it takes. Working from simple to specific shapes. Remember to keep track of your color wheel in terms of your complementaries in order to prevent the oversaturation of skin tones. And that's how you can get a old master styled painting using modern materials. And now, to complete this painting, we're just going to put some of the fine details into the clothing that the model's wearing. Working with lead white over top of the alkyd underlayer. And now we'll put all the little details. Make sure that the small details are saved for last, built onto the larger superstructures. And we're just scrubbing a little bit of texture onto the painting. for the final touches. And there you have it. I really hope that this painting demonstration helps you out. And if these videos do help you out, please consider checking out my online classes on patreon.com/upariartist. And my online classes begin at just $10 a month, which gets you access to all of the pre-recorded videos. We have over 50 plus lessons with 2 new lessons added weekly. We also have other benefits such as painting together each week on Zoom in a group and watching the lessons streamed live in the live stream tier. And there are also many other benefits in my online classes. So please check out my online classes on patreon.com/upariartist. Once again, thank you all so much for watching this week's YouTube video. Again, I really hope that it helps you out. I wish you the very best in all of your artwork, and I'll see you on the next one.